Today we are talking about the all-time best comic book rock star. Not Jim Lee, not Todd McFarlane, but of course, Jim Steranko. Coming at ya. Hey all you agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., this is Dante D, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. If you're new to the channel today, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and check out the channel for other videos on topics related to geek culture. And as always, do not forget to follow the channel on Twitter and Instagram. So Jim Steranko, the artist that I really consider to be the greatest rock star in the comic book medium. Now, when people think rock star artists, they're thinking about maybe Todd McFarlane or Jim Lee or Will Sportasio, those guys that were rock stars in the late 80s and early 90s. But before them, there was an artist who was much cooler, much more talented, and really badass. And honestly, I'm not the only one who thinks that. Steranko has, in comic books history, been considered to be one of the first rock star artists.
Steranko was the first rock star artist in comics. Like a rock star, he pushed the boundaries of what the Comics Code found acceptable in the late 60s.
In order to understand why Jim Steranko was such a rock star in the comic book medium, I think we really need to look at the person, Jim Steranko, and what he's done in his life. Jim Steranko was born in 1938 in Pennsylvania in this really small mining town. Now, growing up, Steranko was a little bit on the smaller side, so naturally he got picked on while he was at school. But instead of just curling up in a ball and crying and just giving up, he took matters into his own hands. He enrolled in some boxing lessons and wrestling lessons at the YMCA, and eventually he was able to fight back and really stick it to those bullies. Steranko really liked art and drawing from an early age, and there are stories of him taking scrap paper from the mail and using that as doodle paper. As he got a little bit older, Steranko started investing in his own art supplies. His family didn't really support his artistic talent, and they didn't really have a lot of money to give him some of the things that he wanted. So he actually would collect scrap paper to sell to scrap paper dealers, or he would find recyclables to trade in for money to buy art supplies. Throughout his teenage years, Steranko was a little bit of a BA. He would get into fights, and he actually was arrested at 17 for being involved in a car theft as well.
I grabbed this guy by his shirt, and I said, "I'm going to throw you out this window if you don't pay me for those 3 pages." Well, in his infinite wisdom, he decided to pay me for the 3 pages, and we were cool about it.
Throughout these years, he still continued in his art, and he also trained as a magician, illusionist, escape artist, and a musician. Here's a guy who could draw, was an escape artist and a musician, and on top of it was in a rock band. I don't know about you guys, but I think that is really freaking cool. Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, Steranko had some work as an artist, either being a freelance or taking some odd jobs here and there. But in 1966, Jim Steranko arrived at Marvel Comics unannounced because he wanted to show Stan Lee his portfolio. After Stan Lee saw Jim Steranko's portfolio, he pretty much said, "You know what, unfortunately we don't have any work right now, but you're just too good to let go." So this is where Steranko has said in interviews that Stan Lee took him outside of the office where there was a little rack with all these different Marvel comics and all the Marvel titles, and Stan Lee pointed to the rack and said, "Pick one." So Jim Steranko at that point was offered to work on any Marvel book that he wanted. I have to admit, were I given that opportunity, I probably would have picked one of Marvel's hottest titles, like Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or X-Men or something like that. No, not Steranko though, being the cocky SOB that he was, he picked Marvel's worst book at the time, which was Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he said, "I'll take that one," in the hopes of really impressing everyone to show them how he could turn that book around. And boy, did he ever turn that book around. While working on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., Steranko experimented with a lot of different art styles and incorporated them into his own work.
I brought surrealism to comics. I brought expressionism into comics. I brought pop art and op art, optical effects, into comics.
And the fans ate it up. The thing that was really significant about this is, at this point in time, Marvel was pretty much used to getting mail and fan mail from young adults, children, saying how great their books were, But Steranko was getting fan mail from college students and art students and people that were really engrossed in 1960s culture. At the time, Steranko was working on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., psychedelic art, pop art, all of these different art styles were very popular. And I think Steranko was really a genius to be able to tap into that cultural zeitgeist during the 1960s, incorporate it into his own work, and rise to prominence. But he rose to prominence not only as a good artist, but as this really cool guy. He really had this kind of like rock star status at Marvel Comics even at that time.
There was this whole cult of personality created around Steranko. You know, you didn't even hear his first name, it was just Steranko. And he was very aloof, and, you know, the pictures you saw of him were grainy and blurry, and, you know, it's just this whole mystique around Steranko.
A lot of people were even calling him the Jimi Hendrix of comics, and I think that is a very fair comparison. Not only because Steranko and Hendrix are contemporaries, but they both did very revolutionary, very unprecedented, and very cool work.
Jim Steranko, many people consider the Jimi Hendrix of comic book art in the late 60s, because just like Hendrix, he came on like a comet, an overnight sensation.
I think the other thing that made Steranko such a rock star in the 1960s was how he flirted with the Comics Code Authority. At the time, during the 1960s, all comics that were going to be published needed to be approved by the Comics Code Authority, which was a self-governing body that made sure that all of the content that was in a particular comic book was not too sexualized or too gruesome or too violent, and was just basically wholesome. It would not offend or disrupt anybody's natural cognitive processes. So Jim Steranko, while working on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., was known for introducing very sexy type female characters in his work. They're often referred to as Bond girls because he kind of started treating this Nick Fury as kind of like a James Bond type character. Steranko would often draw them in skin tight clothes, or he would draw them with cleavage lines, and the Authority would take the cleavage lines out of his girls. But there was one particular instance on a page out of one of Steranko's comic books where he was kind of depicting a love-making scene. Well, the Comics Code Authority said, no, you can't have that. You can't have love-making because I guess it was Nick Fury and his girlfriend, the Countess Valentina or something like that, where they were embracing. So what was done was that little scene was replaced with a gun going in a holster.
This huge pistol shoved into the confines of a shoulder holster was much more suggestive than anything I had on that page.
So let's just recap here. We have a guy who played in a rock band, was an escape artist and a magician, an comic book artist, and a very good one at that, who was really incorporating a lot of sophisticated art styles to his own work, and a guy who was consistently trying to get away with going against comic book industry norms at the time. I'm sorry, this guy is just awesome, and if that's not a rock star, I don't know what is. Well, maybe that time when Jim Steranko slapped Bob Kane across the face would be a little bit more rock star than any of those other times, but I don't know. Yes, you heard right. Jim Steranko, at one time in his life, slapped the creator of Batman, Bob Kane, across the face. I'm sure you're wanting some context here at this point. So on top of being a comic book artist, escape artist, and magician, rock star musician, Jim Steranko was also an author. Jim Steranko wrote The History of Comics, which was a 2-volume set which documented the entire history of comic books. Well, one year at San Diego Comic-Con, Bob Kane and Jim Steranko happened to meet. And Jim Steranko tells that the whole time that they were chatting, all Bob Kane was doing was complaining about the chapter that Jim Steranko wrote about him. Bob Kane really felt that Jim Steranko was giving way too much credit to Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson for their contributions to Batman and the Joker. So naturally, Jim Steranko was a pretty proud guy. He was very proud of his work, and he had every right to be. He was a very accomplished man. He was getting increasingly more annoyed with Bob Kane's criticisms of his book. But that's not what led Jim Steranko to actually slapping Bob Kane. Jim Steranko tells that at the end of their conversation, Bob Kane very condescendingly said,
"See you later, Jim baby,"
and hit him across the face, which was a little harder than Steranko could tolerate. Steranko didn't get him back right at that moment because I guess Bob Kane walked away too quickly. But the next day, Steranko purposely went to go find Bob Kane, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, remember me?"
He said, "Sure, Steranko." And I bitch slapped him across the face. And I said, "See you later, Bob, baby."
I'm sorry, that is just hilarious, and I think that this guy is a legend and a rock star, not only because of all his contributions to comic books and all the things that he's done in his life, but also due to this moment right here. Now, I don't dislike Bob Kane. I'm very appreciative of his contributions to the comic book medium and for creating and helping to create one of my all-time favorite superheroes, Batman. But from what I heard, Bob Kane was a very, very pompous, arrogant jerk. And it wasn't just Jim Steranko who felt that about Bob Kane. Stan Lee himself has also hinted in interviews that Bob Kane was a little bit of a jerk. I guess Stan Lee used to say that he and his wife used to go out with Bob Kane and his wife for dinner every so often, and Bob Kane would always be chronically late, and every time they were in a restaurant, Bob Kane would say to the waiter,
"Hey, young man, you know who I am? I created the Batman."
and then I guess Bob Kane would do like a little sketch on a napkin and then give it to him, and Stan Lee was like, do you have to do that? Like, but anyway, those are my thoughts on why I believe that Jim Steranko was a rock star in the comic book industry, but not only a rock star, but the rock star of the comic book industry. What do you think? Are there any other comic book artists out there who had lives as cool and as interesting as the life of Jim Steranko? If you do know of another artist who was as rock star as Jim Steranko, please let me know in the comments. Until next time, this is Dante D signing off.